In the summer of 1972, the first thing that struck me was how quiet the phone was. Angela called every Monday after work, without fail, just to check on the kids and tell me what happened at the hospital that day. But that evening, there was nothing. No ring, no stories, just silence. I remember glancing at the clock and thinking, she probably got caught up helping someone again. But when the second hand hit 7:30 and I still hadn't heard from her, something in my stomach turned over. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from down in the comments and tap that like and subscribe if stories like this ever brushed past your hometown or your own life. Every click helps pull another forgotten name back into the light. My name's Margaret Lane. I was 29 back then, raising two little ones and living across town from my older sister Angela. We both grew up in Rochester, New York. It was a different place in those days. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. You knew your neighbors' names. We left our screen doors open in the summer and nobody worried much about locking their front door unless they were going out of town. Angela worked at St. Mary's Hospital right downtown pediatric wing. She loved that job like it was her calling. Never missed a shift. She had this calm, soft way with sick kids that just made you believe everything was going to be okay. She rode her powder blue Schwinn to work every morning, her nurse's cap pinned tight so the wind wouldn't take it. Had a little wicker basket on the front for her lunch and her book. She didn't drive, said biking gave her peace. Angela was 32 and had never married. She used to say her patients were family enough, and honestly, everyone loved her. My kids adored her. She'd bring them coloring books from the hospital gift shop, babysat for me whenever I had to work late. Every Sunday after church, we'd meet at the diner on Monroe. Sat in the same booth, ordered the same coffee, and talked about everything from recipes to romance novels. That was our rhythm. That's what I remember. Our childhood hadn't been easy. Parents split when we were teens. But Angela and I leaned on each other. She always said we were each other's home. And in that summer of 72, things felt steady, simple, the kind of life you don't know you'll miss until it's gone. Looking back now, there were no real signs, no threats, no strange behavior, just one tiny thing that nags at me. The Tuesday before it happened, she mentioned something odd, that a man in a dark car had been sitting outside the hospital entrance for 3 days in a row. She said it casually, almost like a joke. If I disappear, check the guy with the sedan. Then she laughed, rolled her eyes, and changed the subject. I wish I'd asked more. I wish I'd written down the plate number or followed up even once. But you don't expect those kind of comments to matter. Not when your sister's supposed to call after her shift. And not when her bike route home is only 12 minutes long. But that Monday, June 12th, she never called. And when I drove by her apartment at 7:30 that night, her windows were dark. Her blinds were shut. And no one answered the door. That's when I used my spare key. And that's where everything begins. Tom was already in bed when I got back from Angela's place that night. I sat down on the edge and told him she hadn't called, hadn't come home, and her alarm clock was still set for Tuesday morning. He rubbed his face half asleep and told me I was probably worrying too much. Said maybe she met someone, maybe she went out for dinner, maybe she just needed a night to herself. I didn't answer right away. I just stared at the floor. Angela didn't do things like that. She was routine to a fault. I told him I was calling the hospital first thing in the morning. By then, the feeling in my chest wasn't panic anymore. It was something colder, like something had been decided behind a door I wasn't allowed to open. I got the charge nurse on the line just after 6. She confirmed Angela had worked her full shift the day before. Said she clocked out late as usual because she stayed to comfort a young boy's mother. I asked if anyone had walked her out. She said no. Angela had left the children's wing just after 3, headed out the back where staff parked their bikes. That was all they knew. I hung up and called Tom at his office. I told him I needed the car and I needed his help. To his credit, he didn't argue. He was already grabbing his keys when I pulled into the lot. We started at the hospital and traced her usual route. From the employee entrance on Monroe, she'd ride down Main Turn on Oak, then cut over to the quieter streets toward her apartment on Elm. It wasn't even 2 miles. We drove it slowly, windows down. It was early enough that folks were still watering gardens, walking dogs, picking up their mail. I asked every single one of them if they'd seen a woman in a nurse's uniform on a powder blue bike the afternoon before. Most said no. One woman, Eleanor Hutchins, watering her roses, said she saw Angela pedal by just after 3:30. She was smiling, waved as always, said her white cap was still in place. That was the last confirmed sighting. Angela had been less than 5 blocks from her front door. We put up flyers that afternoon, handwritten ones at first. I used the photo she kept in her work badge. She had a soft smile in it, her hair pinned neatly, the faintest dimple in her left cheek. I wrote in bold marker, "Missing Angela, Lane 32. Last seen Monday, June 12th. Powder blue bicycle. Nurse at St. Mary's." Tom made copies at the print shop on our corner, and I took the kids around town handing them out to businesses and neighbors. Most people were kind. A few already knew. News travels fast in places like ours. Some offered to help search. Others just looked down and said, "God bless you." By day 2, I called the Rochester police. The man at the desk didn't hide his annoyance. Said adult women have the right to leave without telling anyone. Maybe she needed a break. Maybe she met someone. I told him that wasn't Angela. She wouldn't do that to me, to her patients, to the kids. He sighed and told me to call back in 24 hours if she still hadn't returned. That was policy. I asked to speak to a detective. He said none were available for non-emergencies. I hung up with my hand shaking. Not from fear, from disbelief. It was like the ground wasn't solid anymore. The next morning, when Angela didn't show for her shift, the hospital called me first. I don't even remember what I said, just that by noon I'd called in sick to my own job and started the search myself. Tom took the afternoon off. We drove the route again, slower this time. Checked alleyways, empty lots, wooded edges behind fences. I knocked on every door from the hospital to Elm Street. People started remembering small things. A truck parked where one hadn't been before. A man leaning against a sedan near the corner of Oak and Pine. But nothing pointed to Angela. Her bike was gone, her purse gone. No trace. It was like she'd ridden into a fold in the air and disappeared. By day 3, police finally opened a missing persons file. Detective Frank Morrison was assigned. He'd been on the force nearly 20 years, said he'd seen plenty of cases like this. Some turned out fine, some didn't. He asked questions, took notes, visited Angela's apartment. He flipped through her books, checked the fridge-open drawers, said there were no signs of struggle. Her bed was made. Her Tuesday uniform was pressed and hanging. Her alarm was still set for 5:30 a.m. Nothing missing but her and the bike. He interviewed her co-workers, our neighbors, old classmates. Everyone said the same thing. Angela wasn't depressed. She wasn't overwhelmed. She had no enemies, no debt, no secret boyfriend. Just a quiet life, a generous heart, and a strong sense of duty. Morrison drove out to the bus stations, checked train manifests, called car rental places. Nothing. I watched him do all this and still felt like he was waiting for something, some twist that would explain it away. Something neat. But this wasn't neat. Word spread quickly. The Rochester Democrat ran her photo on the front page that Sunday. Nurse vanishes en route home, family seeks answers. That helped. Strangers started joining the search. Church groups, students, hospital staff. Even folks who didn't know her gave up their weekends to walk wooded trails and alleyways, passing out flyers, knocking on doors. We mapped every section we covered on a big paper map spread across my kitchen table. I logged every call, every rumor, every maybe sighting. Some were hopeful. Some were cruel. One bus driver swore he'd seen a woman matching Angela's description board, a greyhound headed for Buffalo. A teenage clerk in Henrietta said she'd scooped her ice cream 3 days after she disappeared. We followed up on everything. They all led nowhere. The only real lead came from a fisherman who found some women's clothing near the Jay-Z River. My heart dropped when Morrison called me, but when I saw the items, I knew immediately they weren't hers. I started calling psychics. One, a woman out of Albany, told me Angela was trapped somewhere dark near water. I wanted to believe her. Tom didn't. By then he was tired. He was working extra shifts and taking care of the kids while I paced the halls at night, rechecking maps, rereading statements. I barely ate. Couldn't sleep. Started getting these headaches that wouldn't let go. But I couldn't stop. Wouldn't stop. Angela was out there and no one else was going to find her. Detective Morrison tried at first. He brought in more officers, widened the search area, reached out to state police. But after 6 weeks, his calls grew shorter. His updates slower. He said they were doing all they could, but resources were limited. He still checked in occasionally, left voicemails when I wasn't home, said he'd call again if anything came in. He never did. By late July, the search parties dwindled. Flyers curled and peeled in the summer heat. Neighbors stopped asking if we'd heard anything. And on one humid night in early August, I sat in Angela's apartment with the lights off, listening to the ceiling fan hum, wondering if I'd ever hear her laugh again. I don't know what made me think of it. Maybe the silence, maybe the heat. But I walked to the closet and opened the box where she kept her things from the hospital. Cards from patients, old ID badges, her registration forms. And tucked between 2 folders was a carbon slip with a handwritten number I didn't recognize. There was no name. Just a date in the corner, June 9th. 3 days before she vanished. I turned it over in my hands, trying to remember if she'd mentioned anything. I couldn't. But something about it didn't sit right. I set it aside for the morning. It would be the first of many details that seemed small until they weren't. I took that slip of paper with the number on it down to the station the next morning, thinking maybe it was connected to Angela's work, a patient's chart maybe. Something that would make sense once it was in the right hands. I remember standing at the front desk, holding it out to the same desk sergeant I'd spoken to before, and watching the way his face barely changed. He took it like it was a receipt from the grocery store. Said he'd give it to Detective Morrison. That was all. I waited for a follow-up call that never came. When I stopped by a few days later to ask about it, the same man looked at me like I'd imagined the whole thing. Said there was no record of the slip being submitted. No idea what I was talking about. That's when I stopped going through the front door. Tom told me I was starting to lose myself in it, that I was spending too much time chasing ghosts. I could hear it in his voice, the way he tiptoed around the subject like someone trying not to wake a sleeping dog. I don't blame him now. He had a full-time job, 2 little kids, and a wife who barely looked up from maps and old case notes. I'd tape up new sightings on the refrigerator like they were school art projects. Red pushpins on the wall tracing streets I knew by heart. My world had shrunk to a radius of about 2 miles, everything between the hospital and Angela's apartment. I'd walk the route with a notebook in my coat pocket and re-interview people we'd already spoken to, hoping something had changed in the way they remembered. Sometimes it had. Sometimes it hadn't. But even when people said the exact same thing, I'd write it down like it was new. Because at least then I was doing something. Around the 3rd week, I called the station again and asked to speak to Morrison directly. The call got transferred, then rerouted, then cut off. The 2nd time, I was told he'd be out for the next few days. The 3rd time, the woman on the line lowered her voice and told me he'd been reassigned to another case, but she couldn't say more. She gave me the name of a younger officer handling overflow from cold cases, someone I never heard from again. I left 3 messages and never got a call back. That was the moment it sank in. No one was coming. Not really. That's when I pulled the money from Angela's savings. She'd named me as co-beneficiary on the account the year prior after some administrative mix-up at the hospital. I remember teasing her about it at the time, said she better not die on me just to make it easier to collect. She'd laughed and said if she ever disappeared, I'd know where to start looking. That sentence haunted me later in a way I can't explain. I used a portion of the account to hire a private investigator, Robert Chen, former police out of Syracuse. Middle-aged, polite, didn't talk much. He carried a small leather notebook and asked me for everything I had. I gave him the flyers, my logs, every address, photo, and theory. He spent 3 weeks retracing what Morrison had already done. And then, like clockwork, he came back with nothing. He sat at my dining room table and told me kindly but firmly that there were no signs of voluntary departure, no credible sightings, and no hard leads. He said the likeliest scenario was foul play, that Angela had been taken quickly and quietly, possibly by someone passing through. Someone who left no trace and didn't stick around. He said that sort of thing happened more than people liked to believe. I asked him if he thought she was still alive. He hesitated just a second too long before saying he hoped so. Then he folded up his notebook and told me he'd be available if anything new came in. I never saw him again. The next few months were a blur. I stopped going to family events because I couldn't stand the way people looked at me with pity, with exhaustion, like they were waiting for me to stop talking about her. My own relatives started avoiding the topic unless I brought it up, and even then it was quick and surface level. My sister-in-law suggested I take up a hobby or try journaling, said I needed to process. I nodded and smiled and went home and resorted Angela's closet for the 5th time. I had started keeping her apartment exactly as she left it, paid the rent out of my own pocket, dusted weekly, watered the 2 potted plants in her windowsill, replaced them quietly when they died. The worst was the gossip. You expect rumors, I guess, people trying to make sense of what they don't understand. But the things folks said made me feel like I was walking around in someone else's town. A neighbor down the street told Tom he'd heard Angela was involved with a married doctor from the hospital. Someone at church pulled me aside and asked if I'd checked nearby psychiatric facilities just in case she'd had a breakdown and didn't want to be found. I wanted to scream. Angela wasn't the type to disappear for attention or drama. She was consistent, responsible, thoughtful to a fault. These stories turned her into someone I didn't recognize. And I realized maybe that was the real danger of silence when there's no answer. People build their own. At one point, I tried to confront Morrison again. I waited outside the station until I saw him walking to his car and asked him straight out why no one was following up. He looked tired, said he understood how hard this was for me, but there was only so much they could do without new evidence. I asked him if the department even believed she was missing against her will. He didn't answer, just got in his car and drove away. That's when I stopped asking nicely. I started calling Angela's co-workers again one by one. Most had already spoken to the police, but I wanted to hear things directly. One nurse remembered a maintenance worker at the hospital who had taken an odd interest in Angela, said he often showed up near the pediatric wing, even when he wasn't scheduled there, but she couldn't recall a name. Another nurse remembered Angela mentioning a man who had been loitering near the bike racks a few days before she disappeared, just standing there, watching. I passed that to Morrison. Never heard anything back. I went as far as contacting a local news station asking if they'd run a follow-up. The reporter was polite but non-committal, said there wasn't much public appetite for cold cases unless new evidence had surfaced, said those stories didn't hold attention like they used to. I thanked her and hung up, sat on the floor of my kitchen with the phone still in my hand, thinking how quickly the world moves on when you're the only one still standing still. In late October, I found myself at the Rochester Public Library, not really sure what I was looking for. I checked old property maps, city permits, real estate records, looked for any undeveloped pockets of land between Angela's last known sighting and home. I figured if someone had taken her, they would have needed a place close by to hide her at least for a while. I found one. a half-acre lot that had been industrial land in the 60s, later listed under private ownership but never developed. It had changed hands a few times, but the name that stuck out was Walter Brennan. I wrote it down, not thinking much of it at first. Just one more thread. But something about it wouldn't let go. I remembered that one of Angela's co-workers had said something a long time ago about an older maintenance man who gave her the creeps. She didn't have a name. But I wondered. And for the first time in months, I felt that familiar flicker. Not hope. Just the sense that maybe, finally, I'd brushed up against something real. Something that hadn't already been explained away. I closed the file, copied down the parcel number, and stepped out into the cold. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. I walked back to my car with the slip of paper in my hand, thinking how strange it was. The smallest details always seem to come last. And by the time they do, no one else is listening. That name, Walter Brennan, stayed in my mind like a splinter under the skin. I didn't know why it felt important at first, just that it didn't sit flat. I spent the next morning back at the library, combing through the city directory and old microfiche reels of property records. Brennan had owned the parcel I'd circled, the one just a few blocks east of Angela's apartment, for nearly 16 years, from 68 to 84. Before the land was sold to the city, before it became part of the new park district, it had sat quiet and fenced off, marked private no trespassing. There had been a maintenance shed on the eastern edge near a service road that no longer existed. I asked the clerk if any building plans still existed for that structure. She said anything older than 20 years had probably been discarded, but she'd check. I gave her my number. She never called. Back at home, I pulled out the old map of Angela's last route, the one I used to mark with thumbtacks when we searched on foot. I laid a ruler from the hospital to her apartment. The Brennan property sat almost perfectly in the center, tucked between the last stretch of oak and the turnoff to Elm Street. It was one of the few pockets of land that had been fenced and undeveloped during the original search. I went back to that stretch the next day, parked a few blocks away, and walked the area. The fences were gone now, replaced with landscaping and benches. But something about the slope of the ground, the way the trees clustered near the edge, felt unchanged. I stood by what I guessed had once been the back boundary line and looked into the woods. There was a trail, thin, mostly overgrown, but visible if you knew how to look. Not one of the new walking paths. This one was older, curved, deeper, didn't appear on any of the public maps. I didn't go in that day, just noted it, marked it on my copy. I wanted to be sure before I let myself feel anything. Around that time, Tom and I stopped pretending we were okay. The silence between us had stretched too long, too far. He didn't say it, but I knew he was tired of the weight I was carrying. Tired of how the house felt like a waiting room. I wasn't angry, just tired in a different way. I started spending more nights at Angela's apartment, watering her plants, wiping the baseboard, sitting on her couch with the lights off. I'd light a single lamp by the window and sit with her photo, listening to the hum of traffic on the street below. I never said anything out loud, but I always left the door unlocked just in case. Fall came early that year. I remember the way the air changed, more brittle, more still. I pulled out a notebook and started collecting what I now thought of as contradictions. Not just the missing evidence, but the strange timing of when things stopped. Angela's purse had never been found. Her bike hadn't turned up. And I still hadn't been able to get a straight answer on that carbon slip I'd handed over months earlier. The one with the number and the date. I tried calling the station again, asked if they had any internal logs showing the evidence trail from June. The officer on the line told me records that old were archived. I asked if I could access them. He paused, then said only with a formal request and department approval. I said thank you, hung up, and didn't try again. By November, most people had stopped asking how I was. I think they were trying to be kind. Not everyone knows what to say to someone who never stopped looking. I still saw Angela's co-workers around town, at the grocery store, in line at the bank. They smiled politely. Some hugged me. Most just looked down when they passed. I think people want stories to end even if it's with heartbreak. But silence, real silence, it wears you down differently. That's when I started going back to the old neighborhood more often. Not to search, not with flyers or questions, just to sit with it. I'd park near the south end of the new parkland, just beyond where Brennan's property line would have ended. I'd bring a thermos of coffee and sit on a bench facing the trees. I knew the path was still back there, hidden, but not gone. It felt like something waiting, a story I'd already read, but in the wrong order. One afternoon, I saw a dog walker cut through the trees and vanish into that same path. They came out a few minutes later from a completely different side of the block. That night, I brought my boots and a flashlight. I told Tom I was staying at Angela's again. He didn't ask why. I waited for a clear morning. The ground was damp from rain and the sky still low, but the kind of low that lets in light. I followed the trail where it curved out of sight from the main walking path. The first 100 feet were overgrown, mostly bramble and dead leaves. I moved slow, watching where I stepped, pausing often to listen. There were no signs, no old fence posts. But something about the terrain felt unnatural, too flat in some places, too cleared in others. About a quarter-mile in, I found the clearing. It was small, maybe 15 feet across. A circle of old oak trees marked the edge roots lifting the soil. The light came through just enough to see that it wasn't completely wild. There were scraps of metal buried in the dirt, rusted bolts, something that might have been a hinge. I crouched down and ran my hand along the soil. It felt packed in places, disturbed in others. I stood and walked the edge of the clearing slower now, turning in small steps, trying to take in every angle. It didn't feel like a park. It felt like a place someone forgot to map. There was no bike, no fabric, nothing you could call evidence. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing on something Angela had passed, maybe even stood on herself. I took a photo of the space from 3 angles and walked back the way I came, moving more quickly now, less careful. When I got to my car, I sat behind the wheel for a long time without turning the key. That night, I didn't go back to Angela's. I went home. Tom was asleep already. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table reviewing the photos. The clearing didn't look like much on screen, just leaves and light. But I knew it was more than that. I circled a few things and exposed root, what looked like the edge of a foundation stone. The next morning, I went to the clerk's office again, asked for a list of former city-owned parcels between Oak and Elm. I said I was helping with a historical society project. The woman at the desk smiled and brought me 3 old plat maps. I traced the lines, followed the changes from year to year, and there it was. Plot 144B registered to Walter Brennan, marked utility and storage structure in 1970. The structure had been razed in 1986. There was no demolition report on file. I copied the parcel number and checked the name again. Brennan's address had been listed as the same one until 1984. After that, no forwarding contact. No tax filings. I asked if there had ever been a complaint or police call tied to the property. The woman frowned, said those records would be at the police archives and only accessible through formal channels. I thanked her anyway. She asked what I was hoping to find. I just said, an answer, and left. I didn't go back to the clearing right away. I let the days get colder. I walked past it a few more times, watched where the frost lingered in the grass and where the soil stayed soft. I told myself I wasn't afraid of what I'd find, only what might be missing. On the last Sunday of November, I packed a small spade in my coat and walked the trail alone just after sunrise. The ground was still damp, but not frozen. I found the clearing, stepped into the same circle of trees, and this time I let myself feel it fully. The way the light shifted, the silence underfoot, the weight in the air that didn't belong to the weather. I chose a corner that looked less disturbed and began to dig. Not for remains, not for bones, just for proof that someone had stood here before me and left something behind. I was 10 inches down when I hit metal, and that's where I'll pick up next time. The metal was cold and unyielding under the spade just beneath a shallow layer of packed soil and decomposed leaves. I knelt down and brushed at it with my gloves, half expecting it to be an old tool or a piece of rusted piping. But as I cleared the edges, I saw the shape of it, box-like corners intact about the size of a shoebox with a latch that had corroded shut. The top was pitted with rust, but I could tell it hadn't been just tossed there. It had been placed then covered with care. I sat back on my heels and looked around as if someone might be watching, though I hadn't seen another person since entering the trail. The woods around me stayed quiet. It didn't feel sacred or haunted or cursed. It just felt still. I took a deep breath, then reached down and pulled the box free. It came up with a snap of roots heavier than I expected. I didn't open it there. I carried it back along the path, tucked against my chest, every step deliberate. When I reached the car, I set it in the trunk, wrapped it in an old towel I kept back there for groceries, and drove straight to Angela's apartment. I didn't call Tom. I didn't call anyone. I just went upstairs, locked the door behind me, and placed the box on her kitchen table. I didn't sit down right away. I stood over it for the long time, listening to the wind hit the windows, remembering how she used to hum when she cleaned the counters. Then I took a screwdriver from under the sink and pried the latch open. Inside, wrapped in what was once plastic but had mostly deteriorated, were a handful of items that didn't belong together. A hospital badge from a different county, a tarnished locket, what looked like a pair of earrings pressed into a folded cloth. At first I thought they were keepsakes, scraps left by a previous tenant, maybe. But then I found the driver's licenses. Not one. 7. Each with a different face, different name, different year. Most from the late 60s or early 70s. Some were faded, one had cracked clean across. I lifted them gently, laid them out in a row like cards in a game I didn't want to win. They were all women, all young, all with the kind of expression that used to be called wholesome. And then I found the photographs. They were small, black and white, unevenly cut, like they'd been trimmed by hand. Some were of women walking alone, some sitting on benches, some on bicycles. A few looked startled, as if they'd just noticed the camera. And one stopped my breath. It was Angela, outside St. Mary's, standing beside her Schwinn, adjusting the strap on her bag. The date was scrawled on the back in neat ink, June 10th, 1972. 2 days before she vanished. I sat down then. Finally. The chair groaned beneath me. I laid both hands flat on the table and just stared. This wasn't speculation anymore. This wasn't rumors or gaps in memory. It was documentation, pattern, proof. And whoever had kept this box hadn't buried it in a moment of panic. They'd placed it where no one would find it unless they were looking in the exact right place at the exact right time, with no intention of letting go. The next morning I called the Rochester Police Department again. I asked to speak with someone in cold cases and was transferred to a detective named Lisa Rodriguez. She sounded young, focused. I explained what I'd found, gave her the parcel number, the old ownership record, the condition of the box. I left out how long I'd been digging. She asked me not to touch anything further, said she'd be there within the hour. She arrived with 2 officers and a crime scene photographer just after noon. We walked back to the clearing together. She didn't ask me why I'd been there. She didn't ask how I'd found it. She just listened, took notes, directed the team without raising her voice. They took soil samples, flagged the area, and removed the box with full evidence protocol. I watched it go wrapped now in sterile layers out of my hands and into theirs. Rodriguez and I spoke again the next day at the station. She told me quietly that the serial numbers on the driver's licenses matched missing person reports from several counties, that some of those files had gone dormant decades ago. She said the evidence would need to be coordinated across jurisdictions, which would take time. She was careful with her words. But I could see it in her face. This wasn't just about Angela anymore. I asked if she knew the name Walter Brennan. She flipped through a folder, paused, then nodded. He'd been questioned briefly during the original investigation, owned multiple parcels of land, worked maintenance at the old Riverside State Hospital before it shut down in '69. No charges had ever been filed. She said he died in 1995. Heart failure, no next of kin. I asked what happens now. She said they'd reopen Angela's case formally, that it would be reviewed in conjunction with any linked disappearances. She promised to stay in contact. I believed her. That night, I drove home in silence. I didn't go back to Angela's. I didn't go back to the clearing. I sat in my own kitchen lights, low hands around a mug I never drank from. For the first time in 30 years, I didn't feel like I was searching. I felt like I was waiting. Over the next few weeks, Rodriguez called me with updates, small ones, evidence processing, lab timelines. She warned me it would move slowly. And it did. I didn't mind. I'd waited this long. I could wait longer. What stayed with me, though, wasn't the official progress. It was the image of those photos, the angles, the distance, the certainty that someone had watched Angela more than once, had recorded her patterns, marked the days. That meant planning. That meant opportunity. And if she was being followed, maybe others were too. I started pulling out the old news clippings again, articles I'd saved from the early '70s, even ones I hadn't thought were connected at the time. A secretary gone missing in Brighton, a college student in Iron Dequoit, a nurse's aide in Gates, all within 10 miles, all within 10 years, all gone without a trace. I drew a new map this time in pencil light enough to erase. I didn't label the places, just marked each location with a faint X and dated it by memory. Then I circled the center of them all. The clearing sat right in it. There was one more thing I hadn't told the police yet. When I was cleaning out Angela's side closet a few weeks back, I found a receipt tucked inside an old gardening book. It was faded, but the date was legible, June 9th, 1972. The same day as the carbon slip I'd handed over to the desk sergeant back then, the slip that never made it into the file. I still had the copy I'd made in my notebook. I matched the number to the one on the receipt. It wasn't a chart or medical form. It was a transaction. A bike tune-up, a service order from a small repair shop that no longer existed. On the bottom was a handwritten note, replaced back reflector, adjusted brakes, tightened front basket. WB. I stared at those initials for a long time. They weren't conclusive. They didn't prove anything on their own, but they weren't random either. And sometimes it's not the answers that crack things open. It's the handwriting. The routine. The fact that someone left a trace thinking it would never matter. But it did. After I matched the initials on the receipt to Walter Brennan's name, I spent 2 straight days going through every file article and scribbled note I'd ever saved. I didn't even sleep the first night, just pulled out old manila folders, boxes from the back of the closet, even scraps of paper I'd nearly thrown away over the years. The pieces didn't form a straight line, but they started to orbit each other. Brennan had owned the property near the clearing from '68 to '84. That matched the timeline of nearly every missing woman whose license was found in the box. Some of those disappearances had been written off as runaways, others quietly closed due to lack of evidence. But now there was something binding them together, and it wasn't just proximity. It was planning. Detective Rodriguez called to tell me forensics had confirmed that one of the earrings found in the box belonged to a woman named Claire Manning. She'd gone missing in 1971 from the east side of the city, last seen walking home from her job at a diner. Her family had long since moved out of state. The case was cold before it even had time to cool. There hadn't been enough to follow back then, no witnesses, no scene. Rodriguez said they were contacting next of kin now, starting to piece together whether Claire had any connection to Brennan. I told her about the receipt, the initials. She asked for a scan, and I sent it that night. I also told her something I hadn't yet shared, that I'd found more than just that box on Brennan's former property. 2 days after discovering it, I'd returned to the clearing again, this time venturing past the circle of trees. Not far, just beyond where the shed foundation had once stood, I found another trail thinner than the first, almost erased by time and overgrowth. It curved down a gentle slope toward a creek bed I hadn't realized was even there, and near the edge, tucked in the roots of an old tree that had partially upended from erosion, was something else, Angela's bicycle. The paint was nearly gone, the metal frame warped by age and weather, but the basket, though frayed, was still attached. The seat had long since collapsed. I didn't touch it. I just stood there for a long while, staring at it like it was a ghost that had finally decided to show itself. I called Rodriguez from the trailhead, gave her directions. She arrived within the hour, her eyes scanning the tree line the whole way down. When she saw the bike, she didn't say a word at first, just walked around it slowly, notebook in one hand, pen in the other. She radioed for the forensics team. Then she asked how I found it. I told her the truth, said I hadn't stopped looking, not really, that I'd gone back because it felt unfinished. She didn't question that. She just nodded and told me this would change things. After the bike was removed and cataloged, I asked her if she thought Angela was nearby. She looked toward the creek and said, "We'll find out." Then she paused and added, "But you were right to keep digging." That phrase sat with me for days. I'd heard so many people over the years tell me to move on. That closure didn't always come with answers. That peace was something you chose. But the thing is, peace can't be chosen when the story isn't over. And the story hadn't been over for 30 years. It was just hidden under soil and silence. Rodriguez's investigation started to run into resistance not long after that. Not from suspects, there were no suspects left to charge, but from within. She told me during one of our follow-ups that her requests for archival access at the old Riverside State Hospital had been denied twice without clear reason. That some of Brennan's employment records were marked as incomplete or damaged during transfer. That old facility had closed in 1969, right around the time Brennan was supposedly let go. I asked her what she thought he did there. She said maintenance, groundskeeping, maybe some overnight custodial work. But no one really knew. Most of the surviving staff were in their 70s or 80s now, scattered across the state. Some wouldn't talk. A few didn't remember him at all. And the ones who did described him in vague, cautious language. Quiet, kept to himself, not easy to pin down. One retired nurse recalled filing a complaint after she found him in a restricted ward, said he claimed to be fixing a window, but there was no work order. Nothing ever came of it. That's when Rodriguez started working off hours, said it was easier not to ask permission. She pulled old blueprints of Brennan's properties, looked for missing utility permits, searched for overlaps in land transfers that might explain the gaps. Meanwhile, I started mapping disappearances again. Not just the ones linked to the items in the box, but others I'd long since filed away in memory. There was a missing college student from Brighton, 1974. A woman who vanished on her lunch break in Iron Dequoit, 1976. A third who worked nights at a care home near Mount Hope Avenue. All three had no known connection, no shared employer, no mutual friends. Except one detail, each had lived or worked within walking distance of a property Brennan had owned during those years. That detail changed everything. I told Rodriguez what I'd found, gave her the parcel numbers, the dates of sale. She followed up with the county recorder's office. One parcel had been purchased under a shell LLC. Another had no listed owner at all, just a holding company that dissolved in the early 80s. But the transfer logs were still there. Brennan's name showed up twice, once in a handwritten amendment to a property boundary and once in a utilities invoice for storm drainage dated 1975. It wasn't conclusive, but it was enough. Enough to start asking the next round of questions. And that's when the calls started. Not from victims' families or former co-workers, but from blocked numbers voicemails with no name. The first one came 2 days after I spoke with a reporter from Channel 8, just breathing on the line. The second said nothing but stayed on for nearly 30 seconds before clicking off. I told Rodriguez. She didn't say much, just told me to document everyone save any message I got. I asked her if she thought it meant someone else was involved. She didn't answer that directly. But the next day she called to tell me her internal requests were being flagged, that certain people were advising her to close the inquiry for lack of prosecutable evidence. Brennan was dead. The victims were scattered. The damage was old. That's how the file was being seen. I started to understand that this wasn't just a story about Angela anymore. Or Brennan. It was about who looked the other way, who filed the wrong forms, who decided not to dig deeper when a woman disappeared with no clear explanation. The silence hadn't just belonged to the killer. It had been kept alive by every institution that benefited from forgetting. That weekend I went back to the library with a new focus. I wasn't just looking for Angela. I was looking for the places the system had failed to connect her to others like her. I found a zoning appeal hearing from 1973 tied to a parcel on the edge of city limits. The applicant, a property manager named James O'Hara, but the address for payment matched Brennan's P.O. box. The parcel had been declined due to improper sewage access. It bordered a wooded area that's now a power line easement. It had never been developed. No structure, no lighting, just space. I copied the parcel number, circled the street name. Then I sat there with the paper in front of me, knowing that I'd be walking into that easement the next morning. And this time I wasn't expecting answers, just more of the truth we hadn't been meant to find. The easement ran behind an old chain-link fence and a scatter of service boxes half covered in stickers and rust. No real trail, just a flattening in the grass where foot traffic had pressed through over time, probably by kids cutting through or workers checking the lines. But once I stepped past the fence line, the city noise fell off quick. The hum of traffic faded, and all I could hear was the low stir of wind pushing through tall weeds and brittle tree limbs. It wasn't wilderness, but it felt cut off, like a place not meant to be walked anymore. I brought gloves, a flashlight, and a fresh notebook, but more than anything, I brought silence. I'd learned by now that silence was often the first thing to tell you what mattered. About 60 yards in, I reached the edge of what must have once been the proposed parcel. There were no signs, no posted warnings, but the ground changed more compacted with stones near the surface and a kind of faint depression, as if something had stood there once and been leveled poorly. At the far corner, just beneath a crooked utility pole, was a slab of concrete half buried and chipped at the corners. Not large, no foundation, but big enough to have supported a shed or a trailer. I circled it slowly, watching for anything out of place. It wasn't what I found on top that stopped me. It was what I saw in the cracks, bits of rusted wire, a flattened metal tag with no markings, and near the edge wedged into the soil like a forgotten pin, a hair clip. Silver, bent slightly. It wasn't Angela's, not one I recognized, but it was old, worn smooth the way only time or habit could do. I didn't touch it. I walked the perimeter twice more, then stood still and just looked around. The way the brush leaned the curve of the tree shadows, even the way the birds went quiet whenever the wind picked up, it all felt like a place time had worked hard to cover up, like a corner someone had meant to erase. I marked the coordinates in my notebook, took 3 photos, then turned back the way I came. I didn't tell Rodriguez right away. I needed a day to settle with it, to weigh whether this was just another dead end or the edge of something deeper. That night I laid out the map again, the one I'd penciled by hand. I drew a fresh circle around the new location and noticed something I hadn't before. It formed a triangle with 2 other properties. Brennan had once owned one on Maple Hollow Road, the other just past the old brickworks, now long since demolished. Not evenly spaced, not perfect geometry, but close. It was enough to feel deliberate, enough to look intentional. I added a 4th point. Angela's last known location on Oak Avenue. From above, the 4 spots formed a corridor, narrow and long like a funnel. All of it fed back to the original clearing, the one with the bicycle, the one where I found the box. The following morning, I brought my notes and photos to Rodriguez. I expected her to be cautious, maybe even frustrated, but instead she listened carefully, notebook, open pen, steady in her hand. She asked questions. Wanted to know when I'd found the slab, what the soil had felt like, whether the tag I saw could be retrieved without damage. I told her everything. When I mentioned the bent clip, she looked up for the first time and asked if I'd seen anything else around it. Fabric fragments, stains. I hadn't. But something in her tone changed. Not disbelief, but awareness. She asked me to walk her through the layout again, how the sites aligned, what I thought it meant. I didn't answer right away. I just placed my finger on the map, traced the narrow corridor down the page, and said, "It's not random." 2 days later, Rodriguez called to say she'd spoken with a retired forensic tech who'd worked the original 1972 investigation. He remembered Brennan. Not well, but enough. Said Brennan had been on a list, a kind of informal roster of names they checked against when women went missing. But back then, without concrete links or evidence of violence, the list never led anywhere. It was a different time. The burden of proof was heavier than the truth. She also told me something else. The slab I'd found. It matched a materials order from 1971 tied to a purchase of bulk concrete and aggregate, an invoice linked to a local contractor Brennan had briefly worked for. The records hadn't been sealed, but no one had thought to connect them before. Not until the parcel came back into focus. That same week, a box arrived at my apartment from the city clerk's office. Inside were copies of zoning appeals deed transfers and handwritten inspection notes from the 1960s and early 70s. I'd requested them almost a year earlier, back when I was still trying to get access through official channels. Most had been delayed or dismissed as incomplete. But now, tucked between utility permits and complaint letters, I found a list. A maintenance log from the now-defunct Maple Hollow facility. Brennan's name was there. Not typed, not highlighted. Just handwritten in black pen beside entries marked late evening check, off-schedule patrol, and unauthorized access reported dismissed. The entries were sparse, no names, no clear incidents. But there were dates, and one of them was June 12, 1972, the night Angela vanished. I stared at that line for a long time. It didn't confirm anything, but it didn't need to. It was the link. The thread that finally stretched from theory to timeline. I called Rodriguez that evening. She met me at the station, and I handed over the log myself. She read it once, twice, then looked up and said quietly, "We need to go back to the foundation." A week later, they did. The easement was surveyed, the concrete slab broken apart. Underneath, buried between layers of crushed limestone and fill dirt, they found charred wood fragments of metal and something else. A piece of cloth synthetic melted into itself, beige and cream with a faint blue stripe running through the weave. The remnants of what may have once been a uniform. The kind nurses wore in the early 1970s. Rodriguez didn't say it belonged to Angela. She didn't have to. There were no remains, no full structure, no direct proof of what took place there. But it was enough. Enough for her to write a supplemental report linking Brennan to multiple unsolved disappearances across 3 counties. Enough for a formal statement to be released to the press acknowledging Angela's death as part of a pattern of predatory targeting and concealment. I watched the broadcast on a small television in Angela's apartment. Same one she'd had in the corner cabinet all those years ago. The audio buzzed slightly. The anchor read the statement in a clipped tone. They didn't say her name until the second segment, but when they did, it felt quiet, measured, not justice, not closure, just a truth finally spoken aloud. And even then I knew there were more truths that hadn't surfaced. The rest of the items in that buried box, the other women, the properties Brennan bought under other names, the people who saw and said nothing. The records that vanished before anyone could ask why. Rodriguez called later that week to thank me, Said she'd be transferring off the case soon, that it would move into long-term archival review. She sounded tired. I told her I understood, and I did. But I wasn't done, because I still had one more address to visit, one more box of records I hadn't opened. A place upstate where Brennan once worked briefly in 1968. A facility no longer listed in city archives, but its foundation was still there beneath brush and vines and 30 years of silence, and I was already planning the drive. The road to Welter Creek was mostly forgotten by then. The signage was gone, the shoulder overgrown, and the access gate to the property itself, what used to be a maintenance compound for the state health department, hung loose on one hinge. I had to stop a quarter-mile short and walk the rest. The air felt different out there. It always does when you're moving towards something you're not sure you'll survive knowing. Even after everything I'd already uncovered, I kept thinking maybe this part would be different. Cleaner. Final. But the closer I got to the old structure, what was left of it, the more I understood it would be the worst of all. The building had long since collapsed inward. You wouldn't even know it had been a facility unless someone told you. The roof line was a jagged spine of splintered beams, and the concrete floor, what remained of it, had cracked and caved in like the land itself had wanted to swallow it. But the outline was there. The chain of rooms, the foundation lines, the rusted hinges bolted to rotting sills. I walked the perimeter slowly, noting the layers of debris, rebar, broken tile, a panel of wire mesh near what must have once been a small windowed office. That's where I found the hatch. It was almost fully obscured under leaves and detritus framed by moss and dark with moisture. A square cut into concrete, maybe 2.5 feet wide, with a locking ring that had rusted but not broken. I cleared it with a stick, brushed it gently with my boot, and waited. I don't know what I was waiting for, maybe movement, maybe something to tell me not to go any further. But all I got was the wind shifting and the low groan of a tree limb creaking in the silence. I opened it. The air underneath was foul, dry but layered. The kind of stillness you get when something hasn't been disturbed in years. My flashlight didn't reach far, just illuminated the top rungs of a bent metal ladder and the beginning of a dirt shaft descending at an angle. I stood there for a while, balancing whether I should go in alone. Then I made a call to Rodriguez. She didn't answer, but I left a message. I told her I was at the Welter Creek site, that I'd found a sublevel, that I was going in. I kept it short, just enough to mark the moment. I climbed down slowly, one rung at a time. The shaft led to a low crawl space about 5 feet in height, walled in concrete and lit only by the beam of my light. There were shelves built into the stone. Metal. Bolted. Some were empty. Some held file boxes all warped from moisture, their labels nearly unreadable. I kept moving until I'd reached the far corner where a second chamber opened up. This one had a finished floor tile, black and white, most of it cracked, and a door that hung open at an angle. On the other side was a room, no bigger than a supply closet, but clearly built to be sealed. Heavy bolts on the inside hinges reinforced, and in the center of the room a folding chair. Nothing else, just that. The chair was rusted at the joints, its paint flaked off long ago, but it hadn't collapsed. It stood upright, facing the doorway, as if someone had just stepped out and forgotten to turn it. I didn't touch it, I just looked at it, and then I turned my light to the wall behind. Scratched into the paint over and over were initials. Not legible ones, not carved with care, just frantic loops, gouges that might have once been letters. Beneath them, faint but still visible, was something else. A line written in marker. It read, "Not the first." My heart didn't race, my hands didn't shake, but I felt something in me sink, like gravity pulling inward, because it wasn't a scream or a photo or a stain. It was a sentence, a record, a truth someone had left when no one was listening. I took photos, every corner, every scratch. I didn't try to guess what had happened there. I didn't have to. By the time I climbed out, dusk had settled across the trees. The hatch looked smaller from above, as if the land had already started reclaiming it again. I sealed it back as best I could and marked the spot on my map. I drove back in silence. No music. No calls. Just the road and the weight of what I'd seen. Rodriguez called the next morning. Said she'd received the message, but that the case had been reassigned higher jurisdiction federal review. She didn't say more than that, only that someone would follow up. I asked her if they already knew about Welter Creek. She paused, said quietly, "Some of it." I told her what I found. She didn't ask for photos, just listened. Then she said, "We were never going to get all of it, were we?" A week later, I received a call from an unfamiliar number. A man introduced himself as Agent Marrow, said he was reviewing legacy case files tied to interstate activity in the 1970s and 80s. He didn't say Brennan's name, but I knew that's why he was calling. He asked about Welter Creek, about the hatch, about the room. I told him everything. He asked for my photos, and I sent them. Then he said, "This isn't just about Angela." I didn't reply. He thanked me for my time. That was it. 3 days later, I received a certified letter. Inside was an acknowledgement from the Office of Missing Persons, stating that Angela's case had been closed for the purpose of reclassification. Cause of death, undetermined. Presumed homicide. I stared at that line for a long time. There was no closure in it. No comfort. Just bureaucracy carving a name into a larger ledger. I visited her old apartment that evening. I still had the spare key. Everything was just as I'd left it. A faint layer of dust on the windowsill. Her lamp still set to that soft yellow glow she liked. I stood in the doorway for a long time, thinking about how small things become enormous when they're all that's left. The way a chair can become a symbol. The way a line on a wall can say more than a report. The way silence, once unbearable, starts to feel like the only honest response. I didn't stay long. I locked the door behind me and walked down the stairs, each step quieter than the last. Outside, the air was warm. A low breeze stirred the trees across the street. I waited for nothing in particular, just stood there until the streetlights came on. I thought about Angela, about what she might have said if I could have told her everything, about whether she ever thought someone would come looking. Then I reached into my coat, unfolded the last map I had, and ran my finger over one final spot I hadn't yet visited. It was far north, an old train depot Brennan had signed into once back in '66 when he worked temporary security along the northern border. The signature was faint, almost lost in carbon, but it was there, and so was I. The train depot sat just off the edge of the northern line, half sunken, half standing. The tracks themselves had long since gone to rust, swallowed up by brush and time, but the building still held its shape. It wasn't much. A single room, 2 benches, and a boarded-up window where the ticket booth used to be. But on the inside wall, under the grain of old announcements and water damage, was a ledger nailed in place. Yellowed, brittle. And near the bottom, in faint blue ink, was the name I'd traced from that faded employment log, D. Brennan, 1966. There was no doubt it was him. I took a photo, then just stood there, quiet, watching the dust move through the late morning light. There was no revelation waiting in that place. No final confession or secret map. But somehow it was enough to stand in a spot he'd stood to know the timeline was real, to know Angela hadn't imagined any of it. That mattered more than I expected. Not because it solved everything, but because it settled something. And when you've spent years trying to name the shape of a wound, even the smallest certainty feels like a weight lifted. I never found out what happened to Brennan after 1979. There were theories: an alias in Montana, a motel fire in New Mexico, a cold trail that reached as far as Alberta, but nothing confirmed. Rodriguez called once more, weeks after the case was formally archived. She said the Federal Review had opened a few new leads, all classified now. Her voice was different, tired but resolute. I asked if they'd let Angela's family know. She said they will, quietly. That was the last time we spoke. I didn't press her. Angela's apartment lease expired the next month. I boxed up what was left, mostly books, some framed photos, old utility receipts, and a worn-out sweater she used to wear when she didn't want to be seen. I kept one thing, a postcard she'd bought but never mailed, tucked into the back of a drawer. The picture on the front was a stretch of coastline we'd talked about visiting once back when none of this had started yet. On the back, in her handwriting, was a single line. "You were right. There's something here. No address, no date. Just that." I don't know when she wrote it, but I've carried it in my coat ever since. Sometimes I wonder what it would have looked like if someone had believed her sooner. If she'd had a name for what was happening, or someone in power who didn't flinch when the story got too messy. But truth doesn't always travel in a straight line. Sometimes it takes years to curve back around, and when it does, it doesn't arrive with headlines or closure. It arrives with quiet. A door left open. A map with one last mark. A name reclassified, not forgotten. I still think about that phrase on the wall. Not the first. And I know now that Angela wasn't either. There were others, maybe many. Some who escaped and went silent. Some who didn't. Some who never got a file at all. But she left something behind. A trail. A truth. And because of that, more names might still rise to the surface. That's what I hold on to now. If this story stayed with you, share it so no one disappears twice. Not in life and not in memory.